Hi everybody. I'm going to do an overview of the first unit of our semester and talk a little bit about what we've done and where we've been, try to summarize where we are now, and talk then a little bit about where we're headed. So in this first segment, I'm going to talk about the broad concept of the class. We'll begin to get into the broad concept of the Anthropocene, and also some of the questions that have arisen as we've looked at different documentaries that show us something that we can interpret within the framework of the Anthropocene. We've seen 3 documentaries, the first of which is really obviously about the Anthropocene. It's called Anthropocene. And I have a split of 2 images here on the screen for you to look at as we think about deep time, geologic time, historical time, evolutionary time. This very, very complex set of questions that really, in many ways, are at the root of most human intellectual and spiritual and artistic endeavors. Where did we come from? How did we get here? Where are we going? Different cultures at different times, different people within our time answer these questions in an amazing range of ways, right? Some very religious, some based on revelations from above, some divine power delivering a message to somebody. Others, like the scientific worldview that we're primarily spending time with, put together a story based on evidence, material, empirical evidence, and what we can hypothesize on the basis of our observations, and then test. We can continue to update the knowledge that we hold on the basis of those observations to put together an increasingly rich and sophisticated picture of the world. So we're thinking about how we know what we know, where we came from, where we're going, big questions. And these are questions that are very much questions that are part of the humanities, where we think about literature, we think about art, we think about philosophy, but we also think about disciplines like history, the narratives that historians create based on evidence to give us a sense that makes sense, right? An understanding that isn't just jumbled in a bunch of facts about how we got to where we are. And geologic time is told in the form of what we could call Earth history, right? So we're thinking about Earth history, and as we live on Earth, it's our history as well, right? So we also think about human history. Lots of stuff to think about. Very complicated, and a challenge in this class for all of us is to find ways to tell stories to one another in writing, primarily, in your essays, that help a reader engage with these complex questions without feeling overwhelmed, and with an understanding of how and why it might be important to understand this stuff and keep working to understand it better. So, broadly speaking, the question of the Anthropocene, well, as we know now on a scientific level, it's a question of whether we, at this point, here in the present, are exiting the Holocene epoch of the Quaternary period in the geologic time scale and entering a new epoch. These epochs and periods often involve radical transformations of the surface of the planet with regard to the biosphere. That means periods of extinction, mass extinction included, in which in the past up to 90% of species have vanished from the Earth. So that's one feature of a Anthropocene future or present. There are others as well. The primary concept here is that in the future, there would be a detectable stratigraphic layer, right, that would constitute a GSSP, a geological stratigraphic section and point, or a golden spike, where people could come down and say, here's the evidence, definitive evidence that something changed on this planet at that time, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years into the future, the deep future. To help illustrate this, I've got these 3 images here together. One, of course, is of this beautiful forest, Arcadia Grove in British Columbia, present-day Canada. And you see this rich rainforest full of life, organic material, living trees and vegetation, as well as that which has died and is falling back into the earth to decay and become soil. The other side of this picture here, we see this massive coal mining, coal excavating device, monstrous, large machine, digging out layers of the earth, digging down to get at the coal, which is in seams or layers. All right. Now, these two things are happening at the same time, right now, roughly. But we wouldn't really be able to understand the planet we live on, how we got to where we are, who we are, how we do what we do, if we weren't able to recognize the deep time connection. And one deep time connection would be that here in the present, when we have these oil wells that are burning fossil fuel that we suck out of the earth, just like we pull coal from the earth to do what we do the way we do it, right? That doesn't come from the present in a certain sense, although of course it does. It actually comes from the past 300, 400, 500 million years ago, going back into this period, which together can be called the Carboniferous period, Pennsylvanian plus Mississippian, the Carboniferous. When you see these lush forests on the face of the earth, the conditions were right then for rich forests that didn't look quite like this one. Deciduous trees, I don't think, had evolved yet. They were more like ferns and things like this. But when they decayed, especially in swamp-like areas, that material becomes coal, becomes oil over a period of millions and millions of years after being subjected to enormous pressures and heat and so forth. And then we suck it out of the earth, burn it, and as a byproduct, of course, as you know, CO2 and methane, both greenhouse gases, are injected into the atmosphere, which is one of the Earth systems, the atmospheric system, that comprise the larger Earth system upon which everything that we do depends. Without that larger biosphere, without that ecology at a planetary level, no people, no humans, no mammals, etc. So you can see how this all hangs together in a very integral way. That's just one way to think about this stuff, of course, but I think it tells a powerful story. And a story that addresses some of these questions to a point of where we come from, how we get here, what we're doing. Now, there are other questions that come up as well. One's about what it means to be human. And we can think about, quote, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, perhaps, as a place where Werner Herzog asks about, what constitutes humanness. And that's a little different, right? We aren't just mechanical sort of beings who operate on a cause and effect physical level as far as we can tell. Maybe we are, maybe it's all mechanistic, but we have consciousness, we experience emotions, we sometimes have intuitions that suggest very powerfully that there's something in the world that we experience as spiritual or as a soul or as something beyond or above the physical world. And all of this is really powerful stuff, right? Cave of Forgotten Dreams begins to evoke that a little bit as we think about things like religion and art and culture. So this question of documentary, I want us to think about it on one level as how do films work, especially documentary films, which claim to some level be showing us things that are factual, true, real, but also then to start asking more questions about what it means to say something is true or factual or real, right? And especially when we think about the dimension of time and space, or time and space, right? Physics tells us that they're really essentially, in a sense, one and the same, right? And we get a sense of that too here as we go back 4.5 billion years ago to the origins of the solar system and the planet actually coming together in orbit around the sun, and eventually rudimentary life forming and so forth, right? That's one story based on evidence of how we've come to be, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why right? It doesn't satisfy questions that we hunger for, right? What does it mean? Why do we suffer, etc., and so on? What about good and evil, right? These questions. And these are all questions about then truth, fact, reality, meaning making, that often go beyond and exceed the mere scientific, the mere material and empirical. And we'll be spending more time thinking about that this next unit and in our final unit as we begin to integrate different ways of thinking about understanding the world. Out of all the different ways that humans have come up with, we'll be focusing on a couple. In our next unit, we'll explore some of the roots of thinking about the world in a way that in today's language we call ecological. These roots, in this case, go way back to early Chinese culture. We'll be looking at philosophical Taoism as one way of thinking about the world a little bit differently than we often do, and in a way that quite arguably could help us not only think better and more clearly about the question of the Anthropocene, about the ecological present, but also help us change, perhaps, that call for a shift in consciousness that Jennifer Beichwald addresses in her essay on Anthropocene, the Human Epoch. Maybe how do we get there, right? How do we think differently about how human beings relate to the rest of life on this planet? And we'll encounter some interesting arguments coming out of engagements with Chinese Taoism.